بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم اللهم صل وسلم وبارك على سيدنا ومولانا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم سبحانك اللهم لا علم لنا إلا ما علمتنا إنك أنت العليم الحكيم وعنده مفاتح الغيب لا يعلمها إلا هو يعلم ما في البر والبحر وما تسقط من ورقة إلا يعلمها ولا حبة في ظلمات الأرض ولا رطب ولا يابس إلا في كتاب مبين. In the last lecture, we ended by talking about the importance of chains of transmission, of the isnad, and the isnad paradigm, and the importance of that for establishing legitimacy in Islam. So I want to pick up exactly where we left off, and I want to continue that conversation. And today's lecture, inshallah, will be a second part of the introduction to Islamic spirituality, and then moving forward, we'll actually get into the heart of the matter. And where I want to begin is by helping us understand what I ended with what the isnad and the chains of transmission, ijazah, all of that stuff means, because I don't want people to think that just because somebody has a chain of transmission or just because someone has an ijazah in a science or a discipline, it means that they're infallible. That's not what it means. We're all fallible, we all make mistakes. Mistakes have been made in the past, will continue to be made because we're human, that's the human condition. But what I mean by that, why that's important, why that establishes real Islam versus fake Islam, just to make it very simple, is that when you are in the system that we were discussing of these chains of transmission in these different sciences, you are part of a community of scholars in that particular science. So for us today, that's the equivalent of me being a professional and being part of a professional association, or me being licensed. I'm a licensed accountant, or I'm a licensed board certified physician, or I'm a licensed to practice the bar law. I am part of a professional association. That means I can still make mistakes, but there is a system in place, there's a community of professionals in place that can correct me and in extreme circumstances take away my certification if I were to cross certain lines. And you need to think about the ijazah and isnad system that way. The reason that's important is that there are different types of ijazahs. There are different types of licenses that people can receive. Most people are familiar with the popular, common type of license. That's not what I'm talking about. Meaning that, it's very common in traditional circles that we'll read a book from cover to cover, like we'll read Sahih al-Bukhari. For the next 2 months, every day, we'll read a little bit of Sahih al-Bukhari. We'll just read it from cover to cover. We'll finish it, and then because you attended that recitation, I will give you the ijazah, the chain of transmission going back to Imam Bukhari, going back to the Prophet ﷺ. And that is one type of ijazah. And as a matter of fact, this was very, very common in the pre-modern period. The mosques would be filled with thousands of people would attend from all walks of life for the barakah, for the blessing of hearing all of these hadith of this book. Now, when those people receive that ijazah, that's just like a ceremony. That's like a certificate of participation. That doesn't mean that they're experts in hadith. So to make the complex very simple, you can think of the ijazah as having two kinds. There is the ijazah of riwayah, the ijazah of narration, meaning that in that example, you can say, I can narrate the hadith, I have a direct chain back to this book or this author or whatever the case may be, but it doesn't give you understanding of what you're narrating. And that's called ijazah al-dirayah. The ijazah of dirayah is the ijazah of scholarship. That's what I'm talking about. Meaning that you have permission to teach this book or this subject. You are licensed in this field. You are licensed to give fatwa. You are licensed to teach fiqh. You are licensed to teach hadith. You are licensed to teach people tasawwuf, whatever the case may be. But you can go out and practice that trade. That's what I'm talking about. That's how Orthodox Islam or Usuli Islam or real Islam versus fake Islam passes from generation to generation. That's what I'm talking about. So when we look at the hadith of Jibreel alayhi salam, and we talked about Islam, Iman, Ihsan, those three areas, and we talked about the signs of the final hour being part of our theology. So those three areas, whole community of scholarship arose to articulate, to define, to protect, to pass on, to answer questions of those three disciplines. The fiqh, the sharia, of our actions, the aqidah, iman, our theology, our belief, and then ihsan, the subject matter of these lectures, which is, we talked about spirituality, perfection, tazkiyah, spiritual excellence, tasawwuf, etc. We're going to get into the names in a few minutes. So I don't want people to think that, or I want people to understand when I talk about isnad, and I talk about chains of transmission, and I talk about ijazas, exactly what we're talking about. I want people to understand that it's like a community of scholars, a community of professionals, a community of experts that regulate each other. And throughout our history, there have been people, unfortunately, that have stepped out of bounds. People were arrested, people were revoked their positions, they were revoked their license to give fatwa, their license to be judges. This has happened throughout Islamic history. And the reason we have these stories documented is to show us how the system self-corrects itself. There are certain parameters. For you to receive your license to teach, there are certain parameters. There are certain conditions. There are certain ethical standards. If you claim that you belong to a certain school, you can't, go outside the principles of that school. So if I say I'm a Shafi'i, and you ask me a question of law, then I am obliged to give you an answer according to what is permissible within this school of law, meaning within this certain set of principles, first principles, methodological tools of interpreting the Quran and the Sunnah. And if I don't find the answer there, either I say I don't know, or I say, wallahi, we don't have an answer for this in this madhab, so we need to go to another madhab. Either we consult with another expert. Sometimes in the courts, there were multiple muftis or qadis from the different schools of law to represent the difference of opinions, so on and so forth. And these things evolve. I mean, this is not a class on fiqh and things like that, but in the modern world, this has evolved tremendously. It's much more ecumenical, let us say. So that's what I mean by the sanad and the ijazah. So when it comes to this discipline, the discipline of tasawwuf, the discipline of tazkiyah, or ihsan, or whatever we're going to call it, it is no different. And as I said, just as a reminder, we are going to discuss this topic from an academic point of view. And hopefully, each one of you will take from that something that you can implement in your own life to increase your own relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, your relationship with the Prophet ﷺ, and then you'll be uplifted with your practice of Islam. But that's how we're not going to be talking about the personal stuff. This is more of an overview. Something else that I said last week, I think I said it, but if I didn't, I'll say it now, is that the main standard of anything being accepted inside Islam, we know, is that it's based on the Quran and the Sunnah. I mean, that's ABC. We all know that. We all say that. We all understand that. If somebody says that, we agree. No two Muslims will disagree with that sentence. Yet, we disagree often amongst many things. One person says this is haram, one person says this is halal, one person says this is the greatest thing that you can do, one person says this is shirk, the same thing. So we have a problem with that statement. So I want to talk a little bit about what that statement means and redefine what is it that we say that everything is based on the Quran and the Sunnah. And that will lead us then shortly into a discussion of bid'ah. The Quran and the Sunnah for us come from the realm of the divine. The Quran, the definition of the Quran in Sunni Islam is that it is the uncreated, eternal word of God. Kalam Allah al-Qadim, the eternal uncreated word of God. Meaning that it is part of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's divine speech. It is one of his sifat, it's one of his traits, his attributes. and it is outside of the dimensions that house our understanding of time, place, circumstance, all of these things that we know that we are confined in. And the Sunnah and the Hadith tradition, even though they are the speech of the Prophet ﷺ, they are divinely protected speech. So the Hadith and the Sunnah, let us say the Sunnah, meaning the speech, the actions, the affirmations, which is the technical definition of the Sunnah, the speech, the actions, and the affirmations of the Prophet ﷺ are also part of the divine guidance that has been given to us. But that divine guidance has to be played out in time. It has to be played out in circumstance. It has to be played out in place. It has to be played out amongst people from different walks of life, so on and so forth. And because of that, the world around us is a quintessential part to how we understand the Quran and the Sunnah. And to this effect, the ulama understood that the revelation sources, the Quran and the Sunnah, are Allah Ta'ala's written book. But the world around us is the observable book. And because they both come from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, of course, there can be no contradiction between the two. Meaning that the world around us, how we live in the world around us, how we function and how we live our lives and the things that happen to us and the things that we experience, the things that we eat and all of the stuff around us, we draw from that meaning that is important for us to also understand the Quran and the Sunnah. And that right there, what I just said, this issue, if you can reduce all of the problems amongst our community globally today, it is this issue. That a large portion of our co-religionists have forgotten this part. That the Quran and the Sunnah are not understood abstractly. There's no special room that you walk into that's utopic where you understand the pure Quran and Sunnah. The Quran and Sunnah has always, from the time of the Prophet ﷺ to our time, until the end of time, until there are Muslims walking the face of this earth, will always be understood as it unfolds in reality. As it unfolds with us, with people, in different places, in different circumstances, different walks of life, different genders, different socioeconomic background, etc., etc., etc. So when we say that everything is based on the Quran and the Sunnah, we should say that it is based on the Quran and the Sunnah in existence, to remind ourselves that the world around us and the way we interact with the world around us is part and parcel of our understanding of the Quran and the Sunnah. You know, for example, when you read the verse, وَالشَّمْسُ تَجْرِي لِمُسْتَقَرٍ لَهَا, that there is a revolution of the sun. Now we know that the earth is not the center of our system, our solar system, but that the earth and the other planets are revolving around the sun. So what does that verse mean, that there is a revolution to the sun? So in the pre-modern period, you could understand that verse as meaning, from our perspective as humans on earth, we look up and we see the sun moving from our perspective, meaning that we say the sun rises in the east and sets in the west. I mean, technically, that's not what's happening. But as time progresses, we also find that there is an access to the sun, and it does spin, and it does have some kind of orbit outside of the solar. The whole solar system has its own orbit. So we say, subhanAllah, the verse has multiple layers of meaning. And all are valid. All are, you can mean from our perspective, you can mean in actuality, this is what's happening. But you're not going to know that unless you observe and get out there and figure it out. And one of the insights, for example, that Ibn Arabi, Shaykh al-Akbar Ibn Arabi radiallahu anhu has, is he says that he observed some of the revolution or the axis and the spinning of the moon, that he actually witnessed it. So even in the tradition of Islam in the pre-modern period, those type of insights existed. So it's not just Quran and Sunnah, abstract of reality. We need to have reality. And the reason I'm emphasizing that is for where I'm driving to, is that a lot of this science of tazkiyah, of ihsan, of tasawwuf, is also based on our experience with practicing Islam. What happens when we pray? Or God forbid, when we don't pray? What happens when we fast? What happens when we don't fast? What happens when we pay zakat? What happens when we don't pay zakat and we hoard all of our money? What's the experience? What happens to people? How is our experience with the Quran and Sunnah? And we don't see the Prophet, peace be upon him, but the Sahaba saw the Prophet, ﷺ. How was their experience? Where are we vis-a-vis that? All of these manifestations, all of these potential questions mean that there's an experience that we have, that we are inherent an experience of the people before us. So just like when I say I'm going to study Shafi'i fiqh, that doesn't mean that I go back to the Quran and Sunnah and I act like I'm Imam Shafi'i and do it all over again. But I inherit, over 1,000 years of legal scholarship, and I understand the Quran and Sunnah through that experience, through that scholarship of community of generation after generation after generation, adding layers and layers of commentary and meaning and redactions and corrections and multiple opinions and fatwas and all of that. I understand Islamic law through that experience. So likewise, when we come to talk about tasawwuf, it has to be based on the Quran and Sunnah without doubt. Imam al-Junayd, who is one of the Salaf of tasawwuf, he said, طَرِيقُنَا هَذَا مُقَيَّدٌ بِالْكِتَابِ وَالسُّنَّةِ, that this way of ours is bound by the Quran and the Sunnah. There's no question about that. It's bound by the Quran and the Sunnah, but by our experience in reading and interpreting and practicing the Quran and the Sunnah. And the companions, radiallahu anhum, they also had their own experience outside of the Prophet's experience, alayhi salatu wasalam. So there's a famous Sahabi, Khubayb ibn Adi, radiallahu anhu, who was at one point in time captured by the Qurayshis and imprisoned in Mecca. And every time they would go to his cell, they would find that he would have grapes. So this was a miracle, that he was given grapes as his sustenance. Now, that's an experience. What's that like? We read about that with Mary in the Quran, that every time they entered into her mahrab, wajada rizqa, they found all of the summer fruits in the winter fruits in the summer. There was no Costco then, unfortunately, so everything was seasonal. Most of us don't know now what is the winter fruit and the summer fruit, but there are seasonal fruits. So they find, not only do they find fruits, but the wrong fruits for that season. The mango is, I'm making this up, but the mango in the middle of the winter. Mango is only like at the end of summer type of fruit. So that's an experience. What was that like? That happened to him. He didn't ask for that. Are you going to say that that's wrong, or that's bid'ah, or that's shirk? No, what's he going to do? He's in a jail cell, and he finds these grapes. The same Sahabi, I'll use him for a couple of examples, Khubayb radiallahu anhu. He goes out one day and he sees Sayyidina Abu Bakr, and he says, I'm a munafiq, I'm a hypocrite. He's like, why? What happened? What'd you do? And he says, I'm with the Prophet, peace be upon him, and I'm in the zone. All I can think about is Jannah and Nar and all of these big meanings. But then I go home, I got my wife, I got my kids, I got to make dinner, everyone's upset, I got, all of these dunya things, so I fall down. So Abu Bakr's like, oh, no, I'm a munafiq then too. I have the same problem. So let's go to the Prophet ﷺ to solve this problem for us. So they go, and they complain to the Prophet ﷺ. We laugh now, but at that point, at that moment, they're like, something must be wrong with us. Why aren't we always in the zone? What's happening? So the Prophet ﷺ said, no, that's normal. You have a moment like this and a moment like that. But if you had remained this way, then you would see the angels and you would shake hands with the angels. So that's an experience. So there are people that's all they're just in a room making dhikr, reading the Quran like 10 times a day, all their life. And they're going to have those type of experience, meaning those things could happen. You could walk around seeing all the angels all the time, which, by the way, is not necessarily a good thing. Because if all of us every day walked around seeing the angel, we wouldn't do anything. We wouldn't fix the mosque, we wouldn't pay the bills, we wouldn't organize the prayer. No, we're just walking around like this, lost all the time. Imagine if it was like that. That'd be a disaster. It would be useless. We wouldn't be able to help our fellow man, our neighbor, our fellow man, meaning our man, woman, etc. We wouldn't attend to our children. We'd just, that the walking dervish example that we have. So the Prophet ﷺ this is not necessarily a bad thing. As a matter of fact, I think this is normal. You can't always be in that zone all the time. Because if you do, you will have a type of experience. You will see things that maybe you shouldn't see all the time. For example. So the Sahaba, they had their own experience. And because they had their own experience, they developed spiritual practices that worked for them. And this is where the conversation of bid'ah comes in, and why that's important. This Sahabi Khubayb, for example, radiallahu anhu, he is the first companion to invent praying 2 rak'ahs before you are executed. So he was executed. But before they killed him, he said, let me pray 2 rak'ahs. So this becomes a sunnah. Not only does the Prophet, not only does he accept this act, but this is like a sunnah now. Because the Prophet affirmed it. He didn't, go to his grave and, Khubayb, how could you do? How you die on bid'ah, man? How could you do that? Did I tell you? He didn't do that. Prayer, is that a good thing? That's a good thing. I'm about to die. What should I do? Should I send something out on Twitter and let the Twitter world know I'm about to die? Or maybe I should pray, make wudu and pray, and then the last thing I do in this world is I pray. That's a good thing. The other Sahaba who in the Qunut, Sami Allahu liman hamida, and he added, Rabbana lakal hamd hamdan kathiran yuwafi ni'mah. So he added this. After the prayer, the Prophet turned to the people. He's like, who said something during the prayer? So everyone thought that he was upset, so he didn't say anything. He said, who said something in the prayer because I saw all of these angels grab it? And he said, I did, that was me. Right? So the Prophet ﷺ, that was an amazing thing that you did. The Prophet ﷺ came to Bilal radiallahu anhu and said, I heard your sandals ahead of me in paradise, walking ahead of me. What are you doing? He's like, I don't know. Except every time I make wudu, I pray 2 rak'ahs. So the Prophet ﷺ, that's what it is. So the Sahaba, should we dare say, invented spiritual and devotional practice that were based on the principles of the Quran and the Sunnah because it worked for them. It added value to their life. They experienced the Quran and Sunnah that way. So this becomes a Sunnah for us. And this is essentially, I don't want to go too far on that, but this is essentially how we should understand what bid'ah means. And this is going to be very important because this is why people don't want to talk about this subject, don't like this word tasawwuf or tazkiyah, etc. Because the modern Muslim, immediately now they think of bid'ah. What is the bid'ah then? The Prophet ﷺ said, "Man ahdatha fi amrina hadha ma laysa minhu fahuwa rad." Whoever invents something in this religion that is not from the religion, it is rejected. So the converse meaning is that if you invent something or bring something and it is from the religion, then it is accepted. The Taraweeh prayer. Sayyidina Umar radiallahu anhu was the one that put the Taraweeh prayer together in congregation. The Prophet ﷺ didn't pray the Taraweeh like that. And then the Muslims of Mecca and Medina competed. The Muslims of Mecca prayed 20 rak'ahs. And at the end of each 4 rak'ah units, they would do 7 tawaf around the Kaaba. So the Muslims of Medina were jealous. We can't do that. So they added more rak'ahs. And that's why in the Maliki madhab, the sunnah of Taraweeh is 36 rak'ahs. Because Imam Malik followed the practice of the people of Medina. So not only did they pray 20 rak'ahs, but the real story is that they added this, we're going to do tawaf around the Kaaba. It's all from the religion. Tawaf is from the religion. The prayer is from the religion. Putting the mushaf together, Sayyidina Abu Bakr and then Sayyidina Uthman. Had we not done that, who knows? We would have lost the Quran. So on and so forth. You can have a whole discussion about that kind of stuff. But you have to keep that stuff in mind, this conversation of bid'ah and experience, and reference it back to this idea of the written book and the observable book. Because the way you practice your Islam, the way the people before us practiced their Islam, resulted in certain outcomes. So we want to benefit from those outcomes. And a lot of this literature, that's what you find. It's Quran and Sunnah. We're not going to talk about anything except the Quran and the Sunnah. But as it is experienced, as it is lived. So we therefore want to benefit from people's understanding. Okay, the last thing I want to say today is a little bit of a formality. Is when you talk about a subject, a new subject, there are 10 points that we use to define what the subject is, any subject. We did this when we did the Sirah class, so I want to do it here. You talk about its definition, its subject matter, etc. And the reason this is important, particularly for this subject, is it will help us understand what we are going to talk about and what we're not going to talk about. So imagine yourself in this giant library with all of these Islamic books, having to catalog them and put them by subject. That's why what we are going to talk about right now, it's only take a few minutes, is very important. How do you catalog all of these books that have been written about this subject matter? Tafsir, that's pretty easy. Any book that talks about the Quran, that's tafsir. Hadith, okay, there's the hadith collection itself, the commentaries of the hadith, the criticism of the hadith, that's pretty easy. The books that talk about jarh and ta'deel, that analyze and critique the chain of transmissions, we can collect those. The books of law, very easy, you can catalog them by madhab. The books of theology, you can catalog them by the two main schools of Sunni schools of theology, Ash'ari and Maturidi. How about all this other stuff? All the feel-good stuff, all the spiritual excellence stuff. How do you catalog them? So these 10 things that we're going to talk about help us understand that. So, and there's only 4 lines of poetry. من رام فنا فليقدم أولا علما بحده وموضوع تلا ووضع ونسبة ومستمد منه وفضله وحكم يعتمد واسم وما أفاد والمسائل فتلك 10 للمنى والسائل وبعضهم منها على البعض اقتصر ومن يكن يدري جميعها انتصر. So the ulama, they like to rhyme everything so you remember them. So in these lines of poetry, there are 10 things that each science, each discipline, you answer to understand how to categorize. So the first thing is al-hadd, its definition. What is the definition of Islamic spirituality? It is the science that explores the rank of ihsan mentioned in the hadith of Gabriel. That's pretty straightforward. So we have a hadith, again, Quran and Sunnah. Gabriel said, asked about ihsan, the Prophet ﷺ answered a certain way. We talked about that last lecture. So this discipline, this science, talks about what that means and how to arrive at it. That's its definition. The mawdu', what is the subject matter of this science? The works of the heart that relates to the reaching of the level of ihsan. The works of the heart. So Islamic law, fiqh or sharia talks about actions, physical actions. Aqidah or iman or belief or theology talks about belief. So spirituality in Islam talks about the actions of the heart. Your emotional state, your relationship, your attitude, your experience with yourself, with each other, with your neighbors, all that internal stuff. It's all stuffed into this subject. Who is the originator? Al-Wada. Now, everything goes back to the Quran and Sunnah, as we said. But what this means is who is the first to write about this subject matter and essentially codify it. And the first book that we have is the book of Abu Qasim al-Qushayri, which in his Risala, and I brought a copy of the English and the Arabic, so you can see part of it has been translated in English. This is the first work that talks about this subject matter. And I forgot to write down his dates.
What is the title of the book?
Risala al-Qushayriya, the treatise of Imam al-Qushayri, the Qushayri treatise, because that's his name. I'm going to take up too much time. I'm not going to be able to find it because my mind is going somewhere else. Anyway, he's from the Salaf, from the first 5 centuries of Islam. This is the first book, and I have the Arabic if whoever wants to see it, that talks about this subject matter in an organized way. So when you say who's the originator of this science, remember when you're thinking of cataloging your books in this library, you might want to also catalog them chronologically. This is going to be the first. And there are other ulama that came after him that commented on this book. And then there are other books. You know, we all know the books of Imam al-Ghazali, for example, that talk about this. Because Imam al-Ghazali wrote about everything. He wrote a lot about tasawwuf or tazkiyah or ihsan. The books of Ibn Arabi and things like that. So he is the beginning to write about it. The nisbah, its relation to the Sharia sciences, which means is it rational or is it from the Sharia sciences? We have two broad categories of disciplines in Islam. The rational sciences are things like logic, grammar. They help us understand the Quran and Sunnah. The Sharia sciences are the Sharia sciences, fiqh, tafsir, hadith, etc. So this is a Sharia science, meaning that it comes from the Sharia, it comes from the Kitab and the Sunnah. It's not an auxiliary science. It's not a tool. It's not a helping tool. It is Islam itself. Fadlihi, what is the worth? What are the sources? We said Quran and Sunnah, and the experience of the people before us in practicing the Quran and Sunnah. So for example, in this book, the first half of the book, he writes all of these little biographical sketches of all of the Salaf that excelled in this discipline. Just a little bit about their life experience. And then you read all of these stories. This guy used to pray 100 rak'ahs at night. This guy used to read the Quran every day. This guy used to fast every day of the year. Different experiences. It's not saying that you have to do it this way, but this is how this person did it. And therefore, because of that experience, he excelled in this discipline. So the things that he said about spirituality, about the heart, about ihsan, we listen to. Because that guy was in the zone. So I want to learn from that, or her. So the experiences of following the Quran and the Sunnah. Its worth, fadlihi, of course it is of the highest worth because this is the goal of Islam. The goal of every one of us is to arrive at a relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, as the Prophet, peace be upon him, said. Hukmihi, what is the ruling in studying it? It's enough that it's fardh kifayah, it's enough that somebody in the community learns it to teach it to others. Its name, ismihi, its name. In this library, what are those bookshelves going to be called? It's going to be called Ilm al-Tasawwuf, the science of Tasawwuf. That is its name. Now we say spirituality and tazkiyah because we don't want to offend anyone and everyone gets mad, but that's what its name is. Just like Islamic law is called fiqh, just like grammar is called nahw, morphology is called sarf, spirituality is called tasawwuf. It's as simple as that. If you were, and the reason I use the library example is, this is a real example. When you go into a library, like when I'm in the Princeton library, trying to find something, and I want to find these books, that's where you got to go. You got to go to the books of tasawwuf to find the commentaries or the manuscripts or whatever the case may be. So that's how it's organized. The benefit, thamarihi, it takes you to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, enough said. And its subject headings, masaili, the 10th thing, is that these are the subject headings that we will discuss in this science are all the sentences we have in the Quran and the Sunnah that deal with matters of the heart that relate to how our experience and our travel to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is. If we were talking about law, then the subject headings would be all of the actions that we have. The sentences that talk about action, physical actions, prayer, fasting, hajj, zakah, marriage, divorce, inheritance, things like that. If it was aqidah or theology, we would be talking about the sentences related to belief. In tazkiyah or tasawwuf, it is the sentences related to the state of the heart. Allah Ta'ala says in the Quran, إِلَّا مَنْ أَتَى اللَّهَ بِقَلْبٍ سَلِيمٍ, except the person that comes to Allah in the final hour with a sound heart. In closing, just a couple points I want to say before we open to questions. The way I began introducing this subject matter is kind of uniform, meaning that this is one subject matter. And in reality, the discipline of tazkiyah, it is one. It is one way that the Muslims follow to purify themselves to arrive at Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But in the world of tasawwuf, there's a lot of plurality. And that's something that we're always going to have to reconcile. That essentially, the people that talk about this subject matter are all saying the same thing, but from different perspectives. Just like the people of fiqh, they're all trying to answer the same questions, but they're coming at it from different perspectives. But they're all on the same team. And that's why one of the principles that we have is that the way to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is one. It's one way. It's following the Quran and the Sunnah. It expresses itself differently, and later on, way later on in the lecture series, we'll talk about some of these different paths and Sufi orders and what that means. They're like the madhab or fiqh, but there's so many of them. They have different names, and what does that mean? But the essence is the same. They're all dealing with these 10 things that we just outlined. They're all dealing with that same thing, but they're coming at it from a different perspective. And they might emphasize certain sentences over other sentences, but the goal is the same. The method is the same. It's following the Quran and Sunnah. It's following the guidance that the Prophet, peace be upon him, left us. The last thing I want to say is more of an academic nature, which is historically there are 3 types of tasawwuf. There is the tasawwuf of the Salaf, and this is the tasawwuf of people like Imam al-Shafi'i, Imam Abu Hanifa, Imam Malik, Al-Fudayl ibn Iyad, Abu al-Qasim al-Qushayri, the first few centuries of Islam. We call that type of tasawwuf is the tasawwuf of the Salaf. After that, maybe around the 4th or the 5th century, we begin another period in the history of tasawwuf, and this is called Sunni tasawwuf, tasawwuf as-Sunni. Because there's very little tasawwuf in Shia Islam for a whole host of reasons. There is a little bit, but it's very rare. We're not going to talk about that. But it's more of a Sunni phenomenon. That is the tasawwuf that most of us will have heard of or interacted with. And there's a third kind of tasawwuf, which is philosophical tasawwuf. And that is the tasawwuf of people like Ibn Arabi and Afif al-Tilmisani, the poetry of Ibn Farid, all of the really high, well, I don't really understand what that means stuff. We're not going to be talking about that. We're going to be talking about Sunni tasawwuf, the tasawwuf of the academic tasawwuf, the tasawwuf of the kitab and the sunnah. Not that any of the other stuff is not kitab and sunnah, but that's more philosophical. The tasawwuf of the Salaf was focused on their actions, personal piety, fasting a lot, reading the Quran a lot, tahajjud a lot, things like that. Sunni tasawwuf, as I said, which is the majority of what we're going to be talking about, it relates the Quran and the Sunnah to the world around us. And the reason I want to focus on that is because that's important for us. Because the likelihood that all of us are going to pray tahajjud 100 rak'ahs every night for the rest of our lives is very, very little. But all of us are leading multiple complex lives with multiple identities. And therefore, relating the Quran and Sunnah into your modes of life, whether you're a student, whether you're a parent, whether you're a sibling, whether you're working, or whatever the case, that's the most useful impact that you can have, that I can give you, is that how do you make sense? How do you have these lofty spiritual experiences, riding the metro to work, or sitting in an hour and a half of traffic, or listening to some boring lecture in school, or having to deal with this or that or the other thing. That's important, because you can, and inshallah you will. And then the philosophical tasawwuf, it deals with thought. And it's really abstract, and sometimes they call it dhawqi, they call it more experiential. That's not really the subject matter for these type of lectures. So I want to end with that, inshallah, and here if you have any questions and concerns, Wallahu ta'ala a'la wa a'la.
Islam, the revelation of Islam has come to the world. First, when it came to the world, it came in relation to the world's surroundings. It has to deal with the world, with other persons, with other faiths, or non-faiths. So how do you categorize that?
The Quran, Islam came for the world around it. So how do you categorize that? I don't understand. Meaning what?
I mean, the interaction of Islam with the world around. How we categorize that?
How do we categorize the interactions of Islam with the world or at the time of the Prophet ﷺ?
No, always. Because it has to change.
Okay.
Islam lives with the world. It has to live with the world, it will live with the world.
So there are three stages to answering that question. We have to understand the Quran and Sunnah. That's one. And then we have to understand the world in which we live. That's two. And then number three is we have to link the Quran and the Sunnah to the world around us. And that's the most difficult. We live as minorities. We don't live in a Muslim majority country. And we ourselves as a Muslim community, we have, there's 50 Muslims in the masjid, then there's like 100 nationalities. Each person has like double nationalities. So we come from different Muslim backgrounds. That's our reality, one of our realities. We live in a certain state. We live in a certain country. Our primary language is English. All of those things must be taken in consideration as I come to the Quran and Sunnah to bring it to answer questions for now. That is the job of the scholars. That's the job of the ulama. From the time of the Sahaba until our time, until the end of time, these three things. Understanding the Quran and Sunnah requires certain skills. You have to know the Arabic. You have to understand the discipline. What I'm saying is real Islam, not fake McDonald's Islam, real Islam. It takes a few years to be able to do that. But then you have to understand the world around you. So somebody comes and asks me a question about vaping. Okay? To be honest, I know very little about vaping. I just found out a couple of weeks ago from we have family friends that have kids that are in college. So I found out from their kids, that have all of the skinny on this stuff, that some of the vaping has like benzene or something, some kind of chemical, flammable chemical inside the vaping device, which is responsible for some of the severe cases of lung collapse and things like that. I didn't know that. So when somebody comes and asks me about vaping, I have to investigate what that stuff. I don't have to just jump in, oh, that's haram. Yeah, I have to understand what that thing is. I have to go to the store, buy a thing, no, I'm just kidding. But I have to understand what that thing is. I have to investigate and things like that. So a lot of people don't do that. They don't want to understand the world around. They want to put their head in the sand, and they think that they're living in the time of the Sahaba. But we're not living in the time of the Sahaba. We're living in the time that we live in now. I have to understand now that the food that we're eating, it's different than the food that the Prophet said. The honey that we eat is not like the honey that, even the Zamzam water that we drink now is not like the Zamzam at the time of the Prophet. And then I have to be able to link the two without violating the principle, the fundamental principles of Islam. If you can do all three, then you can relate the Quran and the Sunnah to your world around you now. If you can't do all three, then you find somebody who can do that, and you stick to them like white on rice.
Thank you.
Questions? You guys ask me later because they've been asking me questions all day from 9 in the morning. About the gym, no, before that, you don't know what happened at 9 in the morning this morning with these guys. You can ask me after class. The people that, this is their weekly entertainment. Any questions? Assalamu alaikum. How are you guys? Sorry. Nothing?
So when you say Salafi, is that the Salafi that you're talking about now, or is it something else?
So what does the word Salaf mean? Okay. So when I say Salaf in this lecture, I do not mean Salafi, which means something else. The word Salaf means the pious ancestors. Who are the pious ancestors? There's three answers that we have in Sunni Islam. The first answer is that is the first three generations, the Sahaba, the Tabi'een, and the Tabi'een. The third answer is that it's the first 3 centuries of Islam, which is about the same as that. And the third answer is that it is the first 5 centuries of Islam, ending with the death of Imam al-Bayhaqi and Imam al-Ghazali around that time. Another way to define the Salaf is that it is the formative period of Islam. It's when all of the sciences of Islam were being formed and codified and things like that. So the Salaf refers to a time period, plain and simple. Just like the Jahiliyyah refers to a time period. Or the Khulafa Rashidun, it refers to a time period. I mean people, but a time period. Salafi, that's something different. Those are people that want to live that time now. And that's impossible. Because you can't do that. You can only live in the age that you live in now. And that's the shortest way of understanding. Now, in some of the work that I do, I have to look into these definitions. There are hundreds of definitions of what Salafism means. So it's you can be overwhelmed by everyone has a different definition. But the way I'm defining it is it's the simplest way as Muslims understand it, is that a Salafi-minded person, they want to live the time of the Salaf now. And negate anything that happened after that, which we can't. That's McDonald's Islam.
Everything after that, according to them, is bid'ah.
Everything after that is bid'ah, yes. Which is problematic because, as we said, that's not what bid'ah means. Some bid'ah become necessary.
So in all this, you didn't mention the word Wahhabi.
Wahhabi. Well, I'm trying to be so diplomatic and politically correct. He's like asking me. So the Wahhabi is a reference to the followers of Muhammad Abdul Wahhab, who died in 1720,
I think, or something.
1720, or
I think it might be earlier.
in the 18th century, the early part of the 18th century. He was a puritanical fundamentalist in the eastern part of what is currently Saudi Arabia. And his followers are called Wahhabi because his name was Abdul Wahhab. And that was a form of Salafism. But when people say the word Wahhabi, they are specifically referring to those followers. The followers of Muhammad Abdul Wahhab become institutionalized in the modern Saudi kingdom because they are the family of ulama that emerge from the Al-Sheikh family, descend from Muhammad Abdul Wahhab. So it becomes institutionalized in modern Saudi Arabia as a I don't know what's a nice way of saying it, as a movement. At its core, it is a type of Salafi movement in which Muhammad Abdul Wahhab, his big thing was, which by the way, he was not an alim, and his father kicked him out of his study circle. His father was a judge. His brother was a judge, and his brother wrote a treatise against him, and they actually fought each other in armed conflict. So it was a very bloody movement, unfortunately. And Cambridge University has a massive encyclopedia set on the Wahhabi movement. I mean, it's very expensive. I know it's in the Georgetown Library. People really want to look into this stuff. And his thing was all of the popular practice of Muslims at that time were the cause of the downfall and the weakness of the Muslims. So they tended to attack spiritual practices. Muslims going to the graves of the pious and the awliya, and at one point they even wanted to demolish the grave that was on top of the Prophet ﷺ, which was extreme. And it was a form of early takfirism, which they would excommunicate Muslims for these acts, saying, "Oh, what you're doing, this is shirk." Where did they get this from? A lot of their fuel for that type of activity was laid out by Ibn Taymiyyah. And Ibn Taymiyyah was one of the medieval scholars, Syrian scholars, who was in many respects a legal genius, but when he came to the subject matter of theology, he unfortunately had some gross mistakes in his theology. And as a matter of fact, because of his mistakes, Ibn Taymiyyah was arrested by the ulama and put in jail. He did not recant at the end, and he died in jail because of what he wrote in theology. And maybe it's beyond the scope of the discussion now, but basically he introduced a new way to talk about Tawheed. And his way about talking about Tawheed made it easier, facilitated the ability to make takfir of Muslims. Because if you did not follow his definition of Tawheed, then you somehow would have been or could be a polytheist or mubtada or something like that. And that's where the seeds of takfirism come from. Yeah.
Reference to the say, observable.
Kitabullah al-Manzur, the observable book.
Observable.
Yeah.
Is there any form of quality control? I mean, it's like, will it depend on individual observation? Or is there a communal quality control?
There is quality control if your senses are sound. وإنما تنكر العين الضوء من رمله. Imam al-Busiri says that the sick eye will negate that it sees the light of day because it's sick. So if your senses are not right, then you mess up. But the things that are observable means that they are replicable. So the quality control in observation is that it's replicable. What makes an experiment? Why can the scientific community accept something? It's because I can reproduce the same results. Every time it's the same. Every time I pick up something, it falls down. So gravity, okay, I can accept that. So the quality control of observation is its replicability. The quality control of reason is we have certain logical principles, rules of logic that things must conform to for it to be acceptable rationally. Where do those rules come from? They come from actually Aristotle and his logic, which the Muslims took certain sections of, and it became our logic as well. So the rules of reason, you study that in the science of logic. How about the revelation, the Quran and the Sunnah? What are the rules, the quality control? They are the principles that the ulama of the Salaf laid down of how we can interpret, how do we judge evidence, the Quran and the Sunnah together. When we put the Quran and Sunnah together, how can we make sense of them? If this sounds like it contradicts this, we have certain principles. So that's the quality control. I like that, quality control. That's what we're going to use, quality control. Salafis don't have any quality control. McDonald's, very low quality control. We are like the 4-star Michelin star restaurant, high quality control. Maybe I'm overextending, but anyway. Okay, we have seconds until we have to pray. Aisha. Yes. 2 minutes. Go ahead.
So some of the terms that you use I'm not very familiar with it. I don't know what others are. Is there a book that you recommend to get us the
So he has a section of terms that he talks about what different words mean. Because a lot of the, every discipline, every Islamic science, a foundational text will always have a definition of terms. Because the different fiqh madhabs, for example, they have different terms for the same thing. So this science is the same way. But to answer your question specifically, tasawwuf, tazkiyah, ahsan, they're all interchangeable. And we're using the word Islamic spirituality. They all mean the same thing. Tazkiyah is to purify. It comes from the Quran. When Allah addresses the nafs and He says, قَدْ أَفْلَحَ مَنْ زَكَّاهَا وَقَدْ خَابَ مَنْ دَسَّاهَا. Blessed is the person that purifies themselves. Tazkiyah. The etymology of the word tasawwuf, or Sufi, or Sufiyya, there are, in one of the early books of tasawwuf, he has over 80 stories of how the word came. Suf means wool, so some of the early ascetics, they wore like wool cloaks that were like, a sign of their poverty. Some say it comes from Ahl al-Suffa, the bench that was outside the house of the Prophet ﷺ. They used to just hang out, like Abu Hurairah, they used to hang out there, and they dedicated themselves to worship and knowledge. Some say that it comes from tasfiyah, from purity. Some even further things say it's related to the Latin word sophis, which is knowledge. Sayyid Hassan Nasr used to like to say that one. So the etymology of the word tasawwuf is different opinions. But in the cataloging of Islamic disciplines and sciences, this subject is called the science of tasawwuf, Sufism. So that ihsan, and ihsan comes from the hadith of Gabriel. When Gabriel asked the Prophet, peace be upon him, what's ihsan, what's perfection or excellence? He said that you worship Allah as if you see Him, and if you don't know that He sees you. So those are interchangeable. This is a good book that will have some sections on the terminology. I hope translated. We'll get into some of the words later. But what's more important is the meaning. Anything else? Yeah.
Why do you think that there's been some of Sufism have been taboo in so many of our communities and not met with outright hostility?
Why is Tasawwuf met with outright hostility? I have to repeat the question. I'm trying to practice doing this. Please forgive me. It sounds foolish now, but then when I listen to the recording, when I go, it sounds odd. There's all this silence because you don't have a mic, so I'm trying to get used to it. Anyway, I think there are a lot of reasons. I think one of the reasons is for people of our age, when we were coming up, the Salafi da'wah in North America was very strong. So there was this, we were bludgeoned with the Quran and Sunnah, but that was never necessarily defined. And oftentimes, unfortunately, people that are part of Tasawwuf have very little knowledge of the Quran and the Sunnah. So their practice is fine, but they don't know how to respond. So it's sort of like, actually, there's this hadith in Bukhari that says this and says that, and why is your thobe longer than your ankle? And, why isn't your beard, down, to your middle of your chest? So the responses weren't there. The other thing is that in Tasawwuf, in popular Sufism, I should say, unfortunately, there are practices that are very weird and strange. Have you hung around Sufis before? Yeah, it can be really weird. I'm as dedicated to the path as, the next guy, but there's some stuff that's pretty weird. And even in the books, the academic books, it's called popular religion or popular Sufism. Because it's like weird stuff. Some of the stuff in the medieval time was really weird. Really, really weird. And that stuff is just bid'ah. That's what the bid'ah is. So that becomes lumped with the greater thing. So people carry those eccentric expressions of tasawwuf and sort of lump it against the whole, the guilt by association. And many of the ulama, for example, that were also Sufis, wrote against the popular tasawwuf of their age. Like Ahmed Zarruq, who's in my chain of tasawwuf, or Ibn al-Hajj, who wrote the Madkhan. There are a lot of people. Allahumma salli ala Sayyidina Muhammad. Sultan al-Ulama wal-Awliya. What's his name? Al-Izz ibn Abd al-Salam, who was a companion of Hassan al-Shadili. He was a judge. He wrote against the common practices of the Sufis. So that's another reason why. So the reason why I'm approaching it this way, academically, is to not talk, we're going to push all that stuff to the very end, to talk about what are some of the practices. Now, a lot of the practices of Tasawwuf are in accordance with the Quran and Sunnah, but people think that they're not in accordance with the Quran and Sunnah. That's a third reason why. So people are like, oh, the Sufis, they worship the graves. Have you ever met a Muslim that worships a grave? I've never met a Muslim that worships a grave. The Muslims don't worship graves, but we certainly love a lot. We love the Prophet, peace be upon him. We love the family of the Prophet. We love the Shaykh. We love the family of the Shaykh. So we have a lot of love, and when you love, you say things that you're not supposed to say publicly. So there's a lot of also misconceptions for that reason. So when it comes to matters of like tawassul, of the Prophet, intercession of the Prophet, peace be upon him, or going to the graves, these type of things, which are the things that Muhammad Abdul Wahhab tried to address, grave worship. No Muslim worships grave because the Prophet ﷺ told us that this will never happen. There's a hadith that says, "Inni wallahi la akhsha an tushriku ba'di." I swear by Allah, I am not worried that you will commit shirk after me. So those, I think, three answers: the strength of the Salafi da'wah at some point, the non-Sunnah compliant actions of the Sufis, and the misconceptions of practice, Sunni practices that are misunderstood. Those three reasons, I would say. But there could be more. Anybody else? Adhan. Okay. Hello. What's your question? Imam Junaid is before him. He's the first to write. To write a manual. So when we say who is the originator, who's the first to write? Who is the originator of the Imam Shafi. Imam Malik, he was the first to articulate.
Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar. أشهد أن لا إله